I'm Dale Smith with the Lynches Historical Society and Museum, and we're going to talk a little bit about one of our exhibits that we call the artifact room. This room is kind of comprised of a selection of artifacts like from the 1900s, late 1800s maybe, all the way up to the 1950s, and how things changed and how people like myself, some of this stuff we actually used when we were kids, and they're no longer even made anymore. So we're going to kind of start on this end here. You'll see a selection of clothes irons, from early clothes irons that you heated on an iron stove to interchangeable clothes irons where you would have an interchangeable base and keep a hot one on the stove, to gas, and then early electric. And you can kind of see the chronological order of how those things changed. The one in the back corner in the back has a chimney on it. It actually burned corn cobs or little pieces of coal out of your fireplace or iron heater. Somebody was asking, what's the deal with the small one? During the late 1800s and the into 1810, 1812, a lot of shirts did not have a collar. You had a detachable collar that was made separate. That was a collar press for ironing the collars. You'll see a selection of medicine bottles and early bottles. The square ones in the middle are called case gins, and they were basically held gin. And then you got all kinds of patent medicines. Plumbing was not the same 50 years ago, much less 200 years ago, where you had iron pipes and babbitt, and then you had to melt the babbitt around the joining the pipes, and that's what these torches were for. These wands was for dressing out the babbitt when you poured them into joints. And that was done up until the 1950s. And you see the carpenter's tools. Barrels were round, and as you're making them, you got to measure them. Wagon wheels are round, and as you're making them, you got to measure them. And this is called a trammel for measuring diameters. And then you see an assortment below that of all kinds of rulers. And then below that is shoe lasts for a shoemaker, and a tobacco cutter, steel trap for critters. You'll see an assortment of whiskey bottles, and they varied a lot. This particular one here is a South Carolina dispensary bottle from the Prohibition periods of the late 1880s up into the 1920s, where the state of South Carolina actually bottled their own whiskey. And the only place that you could buy whiskey in the state, unless it was a bootlegger, was from the state of South Carolina. So those are quite rare bottles today. And you'll see different styles, different types. Then you've got wood planes for the carpenters to plane their wood flat. When the loggers go into woods to capture the logs for making boards, the bark had to come off the pine trees and this kind of thing. This is called a spud. It was for debarking pine trees. When they planted their crops, whether it was tobacco, tomato plants that had to be set, not seeded. This was a stick for walking down the field, poking a hole to set the plant. Now behind that stick are 3 metal pans. Some people call them necessaries, and they would usually be under the bed in each bedroom. They had to be emptied every day, so they were called necessaries. Lake City had a Coca-Cola bottling company. Prior to 1915, up and past 1925 is what we know for sure. But we have 1915 bottles and we have 1925 bottles. And they're actually marked Lake City. And then you have patent medicines. And this is here to kind of show folks the stuff that was produced during the early 1900s to the 50s is still produced today. There's 3-in-1 oil, Lysol. The blue one is Bromo seltzer, which is now Alka-Seltzer. Ink bottles. Got harmonicas. From the digging that we've done, every site that we dig pieces of harmonicas, and we always say that every man must have a harmonica in his pocket. I mean, African American artifacts. We have a West African lute, which has hide, which this particular one has goat hide. And then you can see it was hand carved and made from a gourd. And we have another gourd bowl, which was similar to a guitar, but is much smaller. It was played like a guitar. This lute predated the banjo. These were later, instead of called lutes, they were called banjars. And this piece here was found in an old house that burned down. You've got a little bit of eatery, tin plates, pewter spoons, pewter mugs, eggs, grapes, most potatoes, most everything would come out of the yard and grown. But you would see tinware that started showing up probably the late 1800s, Victorian area. And you see the different patterns. This one is called marbled, and this is called speckled, and you have white. And one of the things that I like about this particular dish pan is it's got these little patches on it. See the little green box says Mendix. We could go to the hardware store when I was a kid and buy a pack of Mendix. They would ask you, what kind do you want, hot or cold? Well, if it's cold, you get these and they've got a little aluminum washer and sometimes rubber later. If it was for hot, they had a piece of mica. And when you put them together, that would keep your coffee pot from leaking and not melting the rubber gasket. We've got mason jars, and around here, especially in the country, everybody canned their vegetables to preserve food for later. And it started off with crockery with a leather cap tied to the top. And you see how the lids changed over time. The second shelf, you see mason jars, and I call that the different uses of mason jars, because this one is a bitty feeder, and they also had a bitty waterer. How many times you hear that your grandpa buried his money in a mason jar in the backyard, but this one's got pennies in it. And if you look at the lid on the large one, it looks like a fish weir in the top. When you turn it on to the side, it's a rat trap. Rat can go in, but it can't come out. Made from a mason jar. This is an artifact that was donated to us. The ACL train came through Lake City. It was the ACL depot, it was the ACL warehouse, and this is a kerosene drum from the ACL train. And we'll have it set up for you guys, and you guys are so welcome to come visit and learn what you can about Lake City and Lake City's history.